Get off my land before I have you arrested! Celeste Harlow's screech cut through the morning air like nails on a chalkboard. I looked up from my surveyor's map to see a woman in a cream-colored blazer storming across the overgrown field toward me, clipboard clutched like a weapon. Her heels sank into the soft earth with each furious step, but she didn't slow down. Behind her, 2 people scrambled to keep pace. I'd owned this land for exactly 3 days, and already someone was demanding I leave. I took a slow breath, fighting back a smile. Whatever she thought she had authority over ended at that old fence line, not on my property. This was going to be interesting. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? I'd love to know who's following this story. And hit like, subscribe if you'd like to help the channel grow. That little thanks button down below means a lot. The March sun hung low in the eastern sky, casting long shadows across the 2-hectare plot I'd just purchased. Dew still clung to the wild grass, and the smell of damp earth filled my lungs with each breath. I stood in the center of what would soon become my organic farm, holding the surveyor's map in one hand and my phone in the other. An old wooden fence ran along the western edge, marking where my property ended and the Riverside Gardens HOA community began. This was freedom. After years of working corporate jobs in the city, suffocating under fluorescent lights and pointless meetings, I'd finally saved enough to buy land and start over. Desmond Pierce, organic farmer. It had a nice ring to it. Then Celeste Harlow arrived. She stopped exactly at the fence line, as if an invisible wall prevented her from crossing onto my property. Up close, I could see her perfectly styled hair, stiff with product, and the way her knuckles whitened around the clipboard. The Chanel perfume hit me from 6 feet away, overpowering the clean scent of morning air. 2 people flanked her, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and a thin woman with kind eyes who kept glancing at me apologetically. I'm Celeste Harlow, president of the Riverside Gardens Homeowners Association. Her voice had shifted from the initial screech to something calculated and cold. She gestured toward the houses behind her with a manicured hand. This land directly impacts the aesthetic value of our community. I folded the surveyor's map carefully and tucked it into my jacket pocket. My voice came out even, pleasant. Nice to meet you. I'm Desmond Pierce. I just bought this property. Any construction on this site requires HOA approval. She tapped her pen against the clipboard for emphasis. We have standards to maintain. The man beside her shifted his weight, Celeste shotting him a warning glance before turning back to me. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder where I'd saved all my purchase documents. I've checked with the county planning office. This land isn't part of your HOA. It's completely independent. I held up the screen showing the property boundaries. See, the fence marks the exact dividing line. Celeste's jaw tightened. She didn't even look at my phone. That's irrelevant. What you build here will affect property values in Riverside Gardens. We have every right to ensure compliance with community standards. The woman beside her cleared her throat softly. Celeste, maybe we should... The single word cut her off. Linda. I kept my tone neutral, though irritation prickled at the base of my skull. This woman genuinely believed she had authority over land she didn't own. I appreciate your concern, but I don't need HOA approval for anything I do on my own land. I plan to build an organic farm. It'll be clean, sustainable, and completely legal. Celeste's eyes narrowed. She leaned closer to the fence, lowering her voice just enough that I had to strain to hear. You have no idea what you're dealing with. This community has standards, Mr. Pierce. Standards that will be maintained. She glanced back at my small wooden cabin tucked in the corner of the property. I'd set it up as temporary housing while I planned the main construction. That eyesore won't be tolerated. The broad-shouldered man, Greg, pulled out his own phone and took a photo of my cabin. The click of the camera shutter felt deliberate, threatening. I watched Celeste's face carefully. Her expression held something beyond neighborhood pride or aesthetic concern. This was personal, territorial. She looked at my land the way a predator eyes prey. Is there anything else? I asked, keeping my voice light. Celeste straightened, smoothing down her blazer. "You'll be hearing from us, Mr. Pierce." She turned sharply, heels crunching on gravel as she walked back toward the HOA entrance. Greg followed immediately, but Linda hesitated. She glanced at me, opened her mouth as if to say something, then shook her head and hurried after them. I watched until they disappeared through the community gate. Then I pulled out my phone again and opened the voice recorder app, replaying the entire conversation in my head, making mental notes of everything Celeste had said, how she'd said it, and the implicit threats woven through her words. Something about this felt wrong. The intensity of her reaction, the way Greg had photographed my cabin, the complete dismissal of legal boundaries. I'd dealt with difficult neighbors before, but this was different. This felt calculated. I walked back to my cabin, a modest structure I'd built myself over the past week. Inside, I spread the surveyor's map across the small table and compared it with the county records I'd downloaded. Every measurement confirmed what I already knew. Celeste Harlow had zero legal authority over anything I did here. But legal authority and actual power weren't always the same thing. I opened my laptop and created a folder labeled Evidence Day 1, uploading photos, property screenshots, and the voice recording. Then I installed the first security camera at the main gate, angled toward the HOA side. The red light blinked once, then went solid, recording. As I tightened the final mounting screw, movement caught my eye. On the other side of the fence, partially hidden by an overgrown hedge, a figure stood watching. I couldn't make out details, just a silhouette that lingered for a long moment before melting back into the shadows between houses. I took a photo of the spot with my phone, zoomed in as far as the camera would allow, and saved it with a timestamp. 10:47 a.m., March 15th. I had a feeling this would only be the beginning. 3 days passed in relative silence. I spent the time sketching plans for the farm layout, testing soil samples, and walking every inch of my property to familiarize myself with the terrain. The security camera at the gate recorded nothing but birds and the occasional deer. I started to think maybe Celeste had been all bark and no bite. Then on day 4, I found the first letter taped to my gate. It was sealed in a pristine white envelope with the HOA logo embossed in gold. I pulled it down carefully, photographed it in place, then carried it inside to my cabin table where better light waited. Notice of violation dominated the top in bold red letters. Below, smaller text detailed my supposed infractions. Unauthorized structure on premises affecting community aesthetic standards. Failure to submit construction plans for HOA review. Non-compliance with neighborhood beautification requirements. At the bottom, Celeste's signature swooped across the page in dark ink, accompanied by an official-looking HOA seal. Violation must be remedied within 7 days or face escalating penalties and potential legal action. I read the words twice, sealed the letter in a plastic document sleeve, and filed it under Evidence HOA Harassment with the date and time, March 18th, 8:15 a.m. On day 6, another letter appeared. This one had evolved. The tone had shifted from bureaucratic warning to outright threat. Final notice, monetary penalties applied, screamed from the header. According to Celeste's increasingly creative legal fiction, I now owed $500 per day for each day the cabin remained standing. The letter claimed the HOA possessed the authority to place liens on my property and even seize assets if I failed to comply. At the bottom, a new line had been added. The HOA reserves all rights under California Civil Code to enforce community standards through any legal means necessary. I sat back in my chair and laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity had reached new heights. Celeste was manufacturing authority out of thin air, wrapping threats in official-looking documents, and hoping I'd be intimidated enough to fold. I followed the same documentation routine, then picked up my phone and called Preston Vale. Preston was a lawyer I'd met years ago at a sustainability conference. We'd stayed in touch, and when I'd mentioned buying rural property, he had offered to review my documents. Now, I need more than document review. Preston, I've got a situation. I explained everything. Celeste's visit, the threats, the letters claiming authority she didn't have. Preston listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. They have zero legal standing, he finally said. His voice carried the calm certainty of someone who'd seen this playbook before. Your property isn't part of their HOA. They can't find you, they can't place liens, and they definitely can't seize anything. But Desmond, here's the thing. People like this don't stop just because they're wrong. They escalate. Document everything. Every interaction, every letter, every threat. Build your case now, because you will probably need it later. Already started, I said, glancing at my growing evidence folder. What should I expect next? Preston exhaled slowly. If she's as committed as you say, she'll try to make your life difficult in other ways. Harassment, maybe. False complaints to actual authorities. Social pressure. Just be careful, and don't engage unless you have to. I thanked him and ended the call. His warning echoed in my mind as I stared at the letters spread across my table. Celeste wasn't going to stop. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was about control, about someone who'd gotten used to having power and couldn't tolerate anyone existing outside her sphere of influence. That evening, I installed 3 more cameras. One covered the north side of my property, another watched the southern approach, and the third monitored the cabin itself. Each camera fed to cloud storage with automatic backups. If Celeste wanted to escalate, I'd have every second recorded. The next day brought the emergency HOA meeting. I didn't know about it until I heard the commotion. Voices carried across the fence line, angry and animated. I walked to the boundary and stood just inside my property, close enough to hear but not trespassing. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, I could see the community center's glass doors. People were filing in, maybe 15 or 20 residents. Celeste stood at the entrance, greeting each one with practiced warmth that never reached her eyes. I pulled out my phone and started the voice recorder, holding it up near the fence. After a few minutes, Celeste's voice rose above the general murmur. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. We have a serious situation that requires immediate community action. What followed was a masterclass in manipulation. Celeste painted me as a threat to their way of life, someone who planned to build an industrial operation that would bring noise, pollution, and falling property values. She showed the photo Greg had taken of my modest cabin, but on the projection screen, she'd labeled it Phase 1 of Unauthorized Development. She claimed I'd refused all attempts at reasonable dialogue, that I'd been hostile and dismissive of their legitimate concerns. She even suggested I might be planning to subdivide the land and create a trailer park. The lies were so brazen they took my breath away. My jaw clenched as I listened, anger rising hot in my chest, but I forced myself to stay still and keep recording. What shocked me more was how readily the audience accepted her words. Heads nodded. People murmured agreement. Someone in the back called out, "What can we do to stop him?" Celeste's response came smoothly, as if she'd prepared for exactly that question. We're drafting a formal petition to the county. If enough residents sign, we can demand they deny any permits for construction. We're also exploring our legal options. She paused, letting the weight sink in. But I need your support. I need everyone here to sign the petition tonight. Papers rustled, pens clicked. Through the window, I watched Celeste move through the crowd, clipboard in hand, collecting signatures like a general rallying troops. These people had no idea who I was, what I actually planned to build, or that everything Celeste told them was fiction. They just signed. My hand tightened around my phone. Every word she'd spoken was recorded. Every false claim, every manipulation, every lie. Preston had been right. This was escalation. When the meeting ended and people began filing out, I stepped back from the fence and returned to my cabin. I saved the new recording and added it to the same evidence file, keeping everything organized as before. As I worked, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, then played the message back. A woman's voice, hesitant and quiet. "Mr. Pierce, you don't know me, but I was at the meeting tonight. Please be careful. Celeste doesn't just threaten, she follows through. Leave before it gets worse." The call ended abruptly. I saved the voicemail and took a screenshot of the unknown number. Then I sat in the dark cabin, listening to the night sounds outside, and wondered just how far Celeste Harlow was willing to go. I woke at 6 in the morning to silence. Not the peaceful kind that comes with rural living, but the wrong kind. The kind that makes your instincts scream before your brain catches up. I lay still for a moment, listening, trying to identify what had pulled me from sleep. Then I saw it through the cabin window, my gate hanging open, the padlock missing. I was out of bed and dressed in under a minute. The morning air bit cold against my skin as I stepped outside, my breath visible in the pre-dawn light. Fresh tire tracks cut through the dew-wet grass, leading straight from the gate toward my cabin. The treads were wide, deep, an SUV or truck. I followed them with my eyes, my pulse quickening as I noticed other details. Footprints near my cabin door, scratches around the lock that hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had been here. Someone had tried to get inside while I slept. I pulled out my phone and checked the camera feeds, scrolling back through the night's footage. At 2 in the morning, the motion sensors had triggered. The video showed exactly what I feared, an SUV rolling through my gate with its headlights off. 2 figures emerged. Even in the grainy night vision, I recognized one immediately. The cream blazer was gone, replaced by dark clothing and a baseball cap. But the way she moved, the way she gestured with that clipboard, even in the middle of the night, it was unmistakable. The second figure was the broad-shouldered man from the first day, carrying what looked like bolt cutters. I watched as they approached my cabin. The man worked on my door lock while she photographed everything, her camera flash occasionally lighting up the darkness. They spent maybe 10 minutes circling the structure, trying windows, testing the door repeatedly. When they couldn't get in, they conferred briefly, then returned to their vehicle and left. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. My hands shook as I saved the footage, not from fear, but from controlled fury. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was criminal trespass. Breaking and entering. I had them on camera, clear as day, and they had no idea. I took a breath and forced myself to think strategically. Call the police now, establish a record, get this documented officially. The police dispatcher sounded tired, but attentive. Within 20 minutes, a patrol car pulled up to my gate. The officer who stepped out was in his 40s, with the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much to be easily surprised. His nameplate read Callahan. I showed him the cut lock first, then the scratches on my door, then the tire tracks. He documented everything with photos and notes, his expression growing more serious with each new piece of evidence. "You got cameras?" he asked. I nodded and pulled up the footage on my phone. Callahan watched in silence, his jaw tightening as the video played. When it ended, he looked up at me. "You know these people?" I explained the situation, the HOA president who thought she had authority over my land, the escalating threats, the letters. I showed him my evidence folder, the timeline I had been building. Callahan listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. "You can press charges," he finally said. "Trespass, attempted burglary, property damage. The video's clear enough for identification if you know who they are." He paused, studying my face. "But I'll be straight with you. People like this, they don't stop just because you call the cops once. They'll be back. I'd recommend upgrading your security, motion sensor lights at minimum. Maybe a sign warning about surveillance and prosecution." I requested a copy of the incident report. He promised to email it within the hour, then advised me to consider filing for a restraining order if the harassment continued. As his patrol car disappeared down the road, I stood at my damaged gate and looked across at the HOA community. Somewhere behind that fence line, she was probably sleeping peacefully, confident in whatever twisted logic told her this was justified. I spent the morning reinforcing my defenses. The old lock was replaced with a heavy-duty version that required an angle grinder to defeat. I installed motion sensor floodlights at 4 points around the property. bright enough to turn night into day. 2 additional cameras went up, these ones with audio recording and license plate recognition. Every upgrade got documented, every receipt saved. The evidence folder was becoming a comprehensive case file. That afternoon, she returned. This time, she brought a lawyer, an older man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. They didn't bother with pretense, just walked right up to my new gate. I saw them coming and activated my phone's recording before stepping outside. The lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth and practiced. "Mr. Pierce, I'm here representing the Riverside Gardens HOA. We have serious concerns about your unauthorized development." I kept my voice level. "My property isn't part of your HOA. I've verified this with the county." The lawyer smiled, the kind that never touches the eyes. "That's a matter of interpretation. The HOA has a legitimate interest in properties that impact community values. We're prepared to offer a settlement. If you agree to vacate within 30 days, the HOA will purchase your property at fair market value." Behind him, she stood with that clipboard, her expression triumphant. They thought they had me cornered. I pulled out my own documentation, the surveyor's map, the county records, the legal opinion from my lawyer confirming I was completely independent of their jurisdiction. "I'm not going anywhere, and if you continue this harassment, I'll pursue legal action." The lawyer's smile thinned. "Mr. Pierce, I'd strongly advise you to reconsider. The HOA has resources and legal standing. Fighting this will be expensive and ultimately futile." She leaned forward, unable to contain herself. "You think you can just do whatever you want here? This community has standards. We won't tolerate some outsider ruining what we've built." Her voice had that edge again, the barely controlled fury of someone who had never been told no. I looked directly at her. "I'm not going anywhere. If you set foot on my property again, I'll press charges. We're done here." The lawyer started to respond, but I turned and walked back to my cabin, leaving them standing at the gate. Through the window, I watched them confer, her gestures becoming more agitated while he tried to calm her. Finally, they left. I downloaded the recording and added it to my files, now labeled Evidence, File 4, Direct Confrontation and Settlement Threat. That night, everything went dark. I was reviewing the day's footage when the lights cut out, complete blackness. I grabbed my phone for illumination and went outside to check the power. The main line coming into my property had been severed, not damaged by weather or animals, but cut cleanly with tools. I followed the line back to where it connected to the utility pole and found the damage. Someone had climbed up and deliberately cut the wire. I was pulling out my phone to call the utility company when I noticed something else. The water valve at the property line had been shut off and the handle removed entirely. Then I saw the cameras. 3 of them had been spray painted black, the lenses completely obscured, but they'd made a mistake. They'd hit the cameras facing the fence line, the obvious ones. The newer cameras I'd installed that morning, positioned more subtly, were still operational. I pulled up the footage on my phone, the screen's glow harsh in the darkness. There they were, the same man from the night before, and another figure I didn't recognize, younger, wearing a utility vest. They worked quickly, the second man scaling the pole to cut the power, while the first shut off the water and painted the cameras. And there, 30 feet back, partially hidden by shadows but still visible, she stood with her phone to her ear, directing the operation. My hand steadied as I saved the footage. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was coordinated destruction of utilities, conspiracy to damage property, possibly even stalking. I had their faces, I had their actions, I had her giving orders. I zoomed in on the second man's vehicle, visible in the frame's corner, and captured the license plate clearly. The utility company said they'd have someone out in the morning. The police non-emergency line told me to file another report. I sat in my dark cabin, surrounded by evidence of escalating criminal behavior, and realized something important. She wasn't going to stop. Not with letters, not with warnings, not with legal threats. She'd crossed from bureaucratic bullying into outright crime, and she'd done it with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. I opened my laptop, running on battery power, and began compiling everything into a comprehensive file. Every interaction, every threat, every documented crime. Tomorrow I'd take it to the district attorney's office. But tonight, in the darkness, I added one more item to my growing list of security upgrades. I'd need more than cameras and lights. I'd need a strategy for when she escalated again, because at this point, it wasn't a question of if, but when. The morning after the power and water were cut, I sat in my cabin surrounded by printed evidence. Every photo, every video frame, every threatening letter laid out in chronological order across my table. The documentation had grown from a simple folder into something resembling a prosecutor's case file. This wasn't just about protecting my property anymore. This had become a matter of holding someone accountable for calculated, repeated criminal behavior. I called my lawyer first. His voice when he answered suggested I'd woken him, but he snapped to attention when I explained what had happened overnight. "Desmond, this is serious. Cutting utilities is a felony in California. Combined with the trespassing, the attempted break-in, you've got grounds for both criminal prosecution and a substantial civil suit." He paused. "How much evidence do you have?" 200 pages and counting, I said, looking at the files spread before me. 47 photographs documenting damage and trespassing, 12 videos showing her and her associates on my property, 8 audio recordings of threats and false accusations, 15 fraudulent HOA letters claiming authority she doesn't have. The lawyer let out a low whistle. "That's more than enough. I'll draft the civil complaint today, but you should also take everything to the police and push for criminal charges. What she's doing goes beyond harassment." After we ended the call, I began the meticulous work of organizing everything into a single comprehensive document. I created a timeline that started with her first threatening visit and tracked every escalation: the letters, the emergency HOA meeting, the nighttime trespassing, the attempted break-in, yesterday's confrontation with her lawyer, and finally the utility sabotage. For each incident, I included photos, video stills with timestamps, audio transcripts, and copies of any physical evidence like the threatening letters. The California Penal Code became my reference guide. Section 602, criminal trespass, misdemeanor, or felony, depending on circumstances, up to 6 months in county jail. Section 594, vandalism and property damage, misdemeanor or felony based on damage amount, potentially a year in prison. Section 529, false personation or impersonation, the one I was saving for later, up to 3 years if she tried anything involving fake authority again. I documented each relevant statute next to the corresponding evidence. By noon, I had a file that would make any prosecutor's job easy, but I wasn't stopping there. I contacted a professional security company, one that specialized in rural property protection. The technician studied my setup and nodded. "Good start, but let's make it bulletproof." For the next few hours, we overhauled everything. New 4K cameras, motion sensors, and automated lights, all linked to secure cloud backups. The bill came to $8,500, and I didn't hesitate. It was an investment in protection and proof. I handed over my credit card and watched as the technician demonstrated the system from his tablet. Every camera angle, every sensor status, all accessible remotely. "If anyone breathes near your property line," he said, "you'll have it in 4K with audio." That evening, as I reviewed the new camera feeds on my laptop, my phone rang. Unknown number again. I let it go to voicemail, then played it back. The same hesitant female voice from before, but this time more urgent. "Mr. Pierce, this is Iris. I'm on the HOA board. I can't keep quiet anymore. Tomorrow night, she's planning something big. She's been talking about it for days. I don't know exactly what, but she mentioned teaching you a lesson you won't forget. Please, you need to be ready." The call ended. I saved the voicemail and stared at my phone. Someone on the inside was warning me, someone who had finally seen enough to break ranks. I added the recording to my evidence file, then opened a new document and began making notes. If she was planning another escalation, I'd be ready. Every camera was operational, every sensor was armed. My phone was set to alert me to any motion on the property, and tomorrow I'd file formal criminal complaints with both the police and the district attorney's office. I pulled up the video from the utility sabotage again, studying her face in the shadows. She looked confident, almost gleeful, as she directed her associates to cut my power and water. That confidence came from years of getting away with this behavior, of using her HOA position as a shield, of intimidating people into backing down. She'd mentioned during the anonymous tip that she'd done this to other families. 2 others had sold their land and left, rather than fight. I wasn't going to be the third. I zoomed in on the license plate of the utility worker's truck, the one who had climbed the pole to cut my power. A quick online search revealed he had had his electrician's license suspended twice for code violations. She was hiring people who had already proven they'd cut corners and break rules. That was going into the file too. As darkness fell, I sat in my cabin with the new security system humming quietly in the background. The cameras showed peaceful views of my property, the motion sensors all green, everything quiet. But somewhere across that fence line, she was planning her next move. And this time, whatever she tried, I'd have every second documented in perfect clarity. Day 12. I was on the phone with a contractor, discussing plans for the perimeter wall, when I heard the sirens. 2 of them, growing louder as they approached. My first thought was that someone had finally reported the real crimes, that the police were coming to arrest her and her accomplices. Then I saw the patrol cars pull up to my gate, and my stomach dropped. 2 officers stepped out, both in full uniform, with badges gleaming in the morning sun. The taller one had dark hair and a deep voice that carried authority. The shorter one wore glasses and carried a clipboard. They looked official, professional, exactly like police should look. But something felt wrong. The way they moved was too rehearsed, too careful. Real cops had a casual confidence born from routine. These 2 looked like they were performing. I activated my phone's camera, setting it to live stream to cloud storage, then stepped outside. The tall officer, who introduced himself as Blake, held up a document. "Mr. Pierce, we have a court order requiring you to vacate this property immediately. You have 10 minutes to gather essential belongings and leave." I kept my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Can I see your badges, please?" The shorter one, who called himself Kim, stiffened. "Sir, we don't have time for this. You need to comply with the court order." I didn't move. "I'd like to see your badge numbers and the actual court order, please." Blake stepped forward, his hand moving to his belt in what was meant to be an intimidating gesture. "Mr. Pierce, if you don't cooperate, we'll have no choice but to arrest you for obstruction." He held out the document. I took it, scanning quickly. The letterhead looked official, the seal looked real, but the details were wrong. The case number format didn't match county standards. The judge's signature was too perfect, too symmetrical, clearly printed rather than signed. And the date was today's date, which meant this court order had supposedly been issued, processed, and delivered in less than 12 hours. Impossible. I looked up at the 2 officers and noticed more problems. Blake's badge number was formatted incorrectly for our county. Kim's shoes were regular leather dress shoes, not the standard issue boots local police wore. And the patrol cars, while painted to look official, had radio numbers that didn't follow the proper sequence. Most damning of all, neither officer had the small details right. No radio chatter from their vehicles, no body cameras visible, no duty belt wear patterns that came from carrying equipment every day. My mind raced, but my voice stayed calm. "I need to call my lawyer before I do anything." Kim shook his head. "You have 10 minutes, sir. We suggest you use them to pack, not make phone calls." I stepped back toward my cabin. "I'm getting my lawyer's contact information. You can wait here." Inside, I immediately dialed 911, keeping my voice low. "I have 2 people impersonating police officers on my property. They're trying to force me to leave using a fake court order." I provided my exact address and described both men in detail. The dispatcher's tone sharpened with urgency. "Stay inside if you can, sir. Real officers are on the way. Do not engage with these individuals." Through my window, I watched the fake officers confer. Blake pulled out his phone, making a call. I zoomed my phone camera in, catching every word. "She's not cooperating. What do you want us to do?" A pause. "Yes, I understand. We'll give it a few more minutes." I panned the camera slightly, and there she was, visible in the distance near the fence line, binoculars raised, watching the entire scene unfold. I zoomed in further, capturing her face clearly as she lowered the binoculars and spoke into her phone. The real police arrived 8 minutes later, 3 cars with sirens blaring. The fake officers' faces went pale as actual cops surrounded them. I watched through my window as the situation unfolded rapidly. The lead officer, the same one who had responded to my trespassing call, took one look at the fake uniforms and demanded identification. Blake and Kim tried to maintain their act for maybe 30 seconds before it crumbled under professional scrutiny. "Where did you get these uniforms?" The real officer held up Blake's fake badge. "These are costume pieces. You bought these online, didn't you?" Kim's shoulders sagged. "We were just doing a job. We didn't hurt anyone." The officer's expression hardened. "Impersonating peace officers is a felony. You're both under arrest." As they handcuffed both men, I stepped outside with my phone, the live stream still running. I walked toward the senior officer and held up my phone. I have the entire encounter recorded, including a phone call where one of them received instructions. I swiped to the footage showing her in the distance with binoculars. And I have video of the person who hired them, directing the operation from across the property line. The officer watched the video, his jaw tightening. "That's her, isn't it? The HOA president you filed complaints about?" I nodded. He looked toward the fence line, but she'd already disappeared. "We'll need a copy of all this footage." He turned to one of the other officers. "Go pick her up, now." And they found her trying to leave through the HOA's back entrance. I watched from my property as they led her to a patrol car, her hands secured behind her back. The clipboard was gone, the cream blazer replaced with a designer jogging suit, but her face held that same expression of outraged disbelief. How dare they arrest her? Didn't they understand she was only protecting her community? A small crowd had gathered from the HOA residences, 30 or 40 people watching their president being placed in the back of a police car. The murmur of shocked voices carried across the fence. Someone called out, asking what was happening. One of the officers explained in a loud, clear voice. "She's being arrested for conspiracy to impersonate peace officers, along with previous charges of trespassing, property damage, and harassment." Back at my gate, the fake officers were already secured in separate patrol cars. The senior officer approached me with a notepad. "Mr. Pierce, I need your full statement, and I'll need copies of all the footage you mentioned. This is serious. Impersonating officers, fake court documents, conspiracy. She's looking at real prison time." I pulled out my phone and began transferring files. As I did, one of the officers opened the fake patrol car's trunk and found the smoking gun. Contracts with both men's signatures, showing they'd been hired for $2,000 each to perform a legal eviction service. Her signature was on both documents, clear and undeniable. The officer held them up, shaking his head. She documented her own crime. I stood there, phone in hand, watching as all 3 vehicles pulled away. The crowd across the fence slowly dispersed, voices full of disbelief and confusion. My property fell silent again, just me and the wind through the grass. I looked down at my phone, at the perfect video evidence of everything that had just happened, and felt something I hadn't felt in days, the solid weight of justice beginning to move forward. The arrest happened at 11 in the morning. By noon, the police had asked me to come to the station to provide a formal statement and deliver all my evidence. I arrived with my laptop, 3 backup drives, and a printed index of every file. The detective who met me, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, looked at the organized documentation, and actually smiled. "Mr. Pierce, in 20 years of law enforcement, I've rarely seen a victim come this prepared." We spent 2 hours going through everything. She watched the videos of the nighttime trespassing, the attempted break-in, the utility sabotage. She listened to the audio recordings from the HOA meeting where lies about me had been spread. She read through the threatening letters, examined the fake court order, and studied the contracts proving she'd hired the fake officers. With each new piece of evidence, the detective's expression grew more serious. "This isn't just harassment," she said finally. "This is organized criminal activity. Conspiracy, fraud, impersonation of peace officers, vandalism, trespassing with intent to commit burglary. We're looking at multiple felonies." She closed her notepad and looked at me directly. "The 2 men she hired, they've already confessed everything. They're cooperating fully, which means their testimony combined with your evidence makes this case airtight." An hour later, they brought her into an interrogation room. I wasn't there to see it, but the detective told me about it afterward. She'd arrived with a lawyer, an expensive defense attorney who took one look at the evidence and had a private conversation with his client. When he emerged, he looked defeated. "My client maintains she was protecting her community's interests, but she acknowledges that her methods may have been overzealous." The detective's response had been blunt. "Overzealous is sending too many reminder letters. Your client committed multiple felonies." The investigation expanded rapidly. By evening, the police had executed a search warrant on her home. What they found in her study would have been comical if it weren't so damning. A filing cabinet full of plans targeting me, including property surveys she'd obtained illegally, notes on ways to force me off my land, and most damaging, communications with others, showing this wasn't her first time. The detective called me with an update. "We found evidence of 3 previous incidents. Different property owners, same pattern, harassment, false authority, escalating pressure until they sold and left. In 2 cases, she bought the properties through shell companies at below market prices." The district attorney's office moved quickly. Within a week, formal charges were filed. 8 separate counts. Impersonation of a peace officer under California Penal Code, Section 538D, criminal conspiracy, criminal trespass, vandalism, attempted burglary, fraud, stalking, and violation of civil rights. The impersonation charge alone carried 1 to 3 years in state prison. Combined with everything else, she was looking at a serious time. Her associates faced charges too. The man who had helped with the trespassing received 6 months for criminal trespass and vandalism. The unlicensed electrician who'd cut my power lost what remained of his professional credentials and faced $5,000 in fines plus restitution. The 2 fake officers, because they had cooperated immediately, received lighter sentences, probation and community service, along with permanent records that would follow them forever. But the real reckoning happened in civil court. My lawyer filed a comprehensive lawsuit: compensation for property damage, emotional distress, defamation, and punitive damages for the deliberate, malicious nature of her actions. The dollar amount made her lawyer wince: $15,000 for repairs and security upgrades, $25,000 for defamation and reputational harm. And because California law allowed punitive damages in cases of malice and oppression, we asked for an additional $100,000 to send a message that this behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Her husband filed for divorce within 2 weeks of her arrest. According to courthouse gossip, he'd had no idea about any of it, had been horrified to discover what she'd been doing, and wanted nothing more to do with her. The HOA held an emergency vote and removed her from the board unanimously. The woman who had warned me, the one who had called herself Iris, was elected as the new president with a mandate to reform the organization's practices and apologize to anyone who'd been wronged. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic. With the overwhelming evidence, her lawyer advised her to accept a plea deal. She refused initially, insisting she'd only been protecting her community, that I was the real problem. But as the prosecution laid out their case in preliminary hearings, even she couldn't maintain the delusion. The videos didn't lie. The recordings were crystal clear. The paper trail of her conspiracy was documented in her own handwriting. In the end, she pleaded guilty to 5 of the 8 charges in exchange for the prosecution dropping the others. The sentencing hearing came 2 months after her arrest. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom as the judge reviewed the case file. The prosecutor presented a victim impact statement I'd written, detailing how her actions had disrupted my life, violated my sense of security, and forced me to spend thousands of dollars on protection that shouldn't have been necessary. The judge looked at her over reading glasses. "Ms. Harlow, you held a position of trust in your community. Instead of using that position responsibly, you systematically harassed Mr. Pierce, violated his property rights, damaged his belongings, and when those tactics failed, you hired individuals to impersonate law enforcement officers. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was calculated, sustained criminal behavior spanning weeks." The sentence came down: 2 years in state prison for the impersonation charge, 18 months for conspiracy to run concurrently, $15,000 in restitution for damages, $25,000 for defamation, and 5 years of supervised probation after release. Additionally, she was ordered to stay at least 500 feet from my property permanently and was barred from holding any HOA leadership position in California. She stood there, hands clasped in front of her, as the bailiff approached. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked small, not powerful, not in control, just a woman facing consequences she'd never believed would come. As they led her away, she didn't look back at the courtroom, didn't acknowledge her former neighbors who'd come to watch, didn't even glance at her lawyer. She simply walked out, and I wondered if she finally understood what she'd done. Outside the courthouse, several HOA residents approached me. Iris led them, her expression sincere. "Mr. Pierce, we owe you an apology. We should have questioned her sooner, should have checked her claims. We're sorry." I accepted their words with a nod. They'd been manipulated, fed lies by someone they'd trusted. That wasn't their fault. But I also kept my distance. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. The trial concluded on a Wednesday afternoon. By Friday morning, the local news had picked up the story. I woke to find my phone flooded with messages from reporters requesting interviews, neighbors expressing shock, and even a few legal advocacy groups asking if they could use my case as an example in HOA reform legislation. I declined most of the attention. This had never been about publicity. It had been about protecting what was mine and holding someone accountable for crossing legal and ethical lines. The sentencing had been clear, but I wanted to understand the full scope of what had happened. 2 years in state prison meant she'd serve at least 18 months with good behavior. The restitution payments would come from the forced sale of her home, which the court had already ordered to satisfy the $40,000 judgment. Her assets were being liquidated under court supervision to ensure I received every penny owed. The divorce proceedings moved faster than anyone expected. Her husband, a quiet man who worked in accounting, had been completely blindsided by her arrest. According to court documents that became public record, he'd provided a statement to investigators confirming he'd known nothing about her activities. He'd believed her stories about neighborhood beautification projects and community improvement initiatives. The reality of what she'd been doing, the lies and criminal behavior, had shattered whatever remained of their marriage. The divorce was finalized within 6 weeks, with him retaining most of their shared assets since her criminal activities had disqualified her from claiming much in the settlement. The HOA underwent significant changes. The new president convened a town hall meeting and invited me to attend. I declined, but sent a written statement through my lawyer. The message was simple. The HOA needed transparency, accountability, and clear limits on what authority they actually possessed. Iris took those words seriously. Within a month, the HOA had revised its bylaws, implemented oversight committees, and established a formal complaint process with external review. They also sent me a formal, written apology, signed by every board member and posted publicly on their website. The fallout extended beyond just her immediate circle. The unlicensed electrician who'd cut my power lines lost his remaining professional connections. Word spread quickly in the trades community, and no legitimate contractor would work with him. He ended up leaving the area entirely, his reputation destroyed. The man who had helped with the initial trespassing completed his 6 months in county jail and 200 hours of community service. When he was released, he came to my property, stood at the gate, and asked to speak with me. I considered refusing, but curiosity won out. I met him at the fence line, keeping the barrier between us. He looked exhausted, older than the few months should have aged him. "I wanted to apologize," he said. His voice was hoarse. "She told us you were a threat to the community, that you were planning something dangerous. We believed her. I believed her. I'm not making excuses, I'm just saying I was wrong and I'm sorry." I studied his face for a long moment. "Did she pay you?" He shook his head. "No. I was on the HOA board. I thought I was protecting our neighborhood." He paused. "I lost my position, my reputation. My wife barely speaks to me. I deserved all of it. I just wanted you to know that some of us weren't doing it for money or malice. We were doing it because we were fooled." I didn't forgive him, not fully, but I acknowledged his words with a nod. He'd served his time, faced his consequences. What more could I ask for? He left shortly after, and I never saw him again. The fake officers, the actors she'd hired, had their own reckonings. Their cooperation with law enforcement kept them out of prison, but their names were now permanently associated with impersonating police officers. Any future background check would flag them. Their acting careers, already struggling, were effectively over. They'd traded $2,000 for permanent damage to their futures. The community's response was the most interesting aspect of the aftermath. Some residents remained convinced I was somehow at fault, that my presence had triggered everything. They kept their distance, occasionally glaring when they saw me near the property line, but most residents underwent a shift in perspective. They'd trusted her, followed her lead, and signed petitions based on her lies. Now they had to reconcile the cognitive dissonance between the authority figure they'd believed in and the criminal she'd turned out to be. Several of them reached out to me individually over the following weeks. One older couple brought homemade bread as a peace offering. A young family apologized for signing the petition against me. A retired teacher admitted she'd been one of the voices at the emergency meeting, calling for action. Each approached with some combination of shame, regret, and curiosity. They wanted to know who I really was, what I was actually planning to build. I answered their questions politely, but didn't invite deeper connection. The damage had been done, and while I could accept apologies, I couldn't forget how quickly they'd turned against me based on nothing but her word. The woman who had warned me, Iris, proved to be genuinely remorseful about the HOA's actions. Under her leadership, the organization underwent real reform. She established open meetings, published financial reports, and most importantly, clearly defined the limits of HOA authority. She made sure every resident understood that the HOA had no jurisdiction over properties outside their legal boundaries. It was basic information, but it had been deliberately obscured under the previous administration. She came to my gate one afternoon, not to apologize again, but to ask a practical question. "We're looking at properties that actually are within our jurisdiction. Would you be willing to consult on what reasonable oversight looks like? I want to make sure we never cross these lines again." I considered her request and agreed to one consultation. We spent an hour discussing the difference between genuine community standards and overreach, between protecting property values and harassing property owners. She took notes, asked thoughtful questions, and thanked me sincerely when we finished. The criminal case closed, the civil judgment secured, and the community forced to confront its complicity. Justice had been served in the most literal sense. She was in prison. Her accomplices had been punished. I'd been compensated for my damages. The system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it had worked. Yet satisfaction felt different than I'd expected. There was no triumphant moment, No sense of victory, just the quiet resolution of knowing that someone who'd thought themselves above the law had learned otherwise, and that others who might have followed the same path had seen the consequences. As spring turned to summer, the news coverage faded. Reporters moved on to other stories. The HOA residents returned to their normal lives, and I was left with my land, my plans, and the knowledge that I'd stood my ground when it would have been easier to leave. 3 months after the sentencing, I stood at my property line with a contractor, discussing the final detail that had started this entire conflict: the wall. Not because I needed it for security anymore. The cameras, the legal precedent, and her imprisonment had effectively ended any threat. But because boundaries matter, and sometimes they need to be visible, permanent, and undeniable. 10 feet high, I told the contractor, a solid man in his 60s who had built half the structures in the county. Concrete foundation, reinforced structure, designed to last 50 years. He nodded, studying the survey markers that defined exactly where my property ended and the HOA began. That's a serious wall. Are you sure you want something this permanent? I looked across at the HOA community, quiet in the morning light. I'm sure. The wall would run the entire length of the western boundary, 300 feet of concrete and steel that would leave no doubt about where my land began. But I didn't want it to be ugly or hostile. This wasn't about spite, it was about clarity. The design took 2 weeks to finalize. The wall would be smooth concrete, painted white to reflect heat and blend with the landscape. On my side, I'd plant climbing vines that would eventually cover the surface with green. At the base, native wildflowers would create a natural border. Integrated LED lights would provide soft illumination at night, not harsh security lighting, but gentle ambient glow. The wall would be beautiful, functional, and absolutely clear in its message. This is mine, that is yours, and never shall the two cross without permission. Construction began in late summer. The contractor's crew worked efficiently, digging the foundation trench along the precisely surveyed line. I watched the process with satisfaction, seeing the boundary transform from an abstract legal concept into physical reality. Some HOA residents came to their back fences to watch, and I could imagine their conversations. Some probably thought I was being petty. Others likely understood exactly why this wall needed to exist. One afternoon, as the concrete foundation healed, a car pulled up to my gate. I didn't recognize the vehicle, but when the driver stepped out, I recognized the face. It was her husband, the quiet accountant who'd divorced her. He approached the gate with his hands visible, non-threatening, and waited for me to acknowledge him. I walked over slowly. "Mr. Pierce," he said. His voice was tired. "I wanted to apologize in person. I should have known what she was doing. I should have questioned her, stopped her. I didn't, and you suffered because of my blindness." I studied him for a moment. He looked like he'd aged 5 years and 5 months. "You weren't the one who committed the crimes." He shook his head. "No, but I was married to someone who did, and I never saw it. That makes me either willfully ignorant or dangerously oblivious. Either way, I failed as a neighbor and as a decent human being. I'm sorry." There wasn't much to say to that. He'd lost his marriage, his standing in the community, and probably his peace of mind. He was already paying his own price. "I appreciate you coming here," I said finally. That took courage. He nodded, climbed back into his car, and drove away. I never saw him again. The wall rose over the following weeks. 10 feet of concrete, exactly as I'd specified, marked with the property line at its base. The contractor's crew worked with precision, ensuring every section was level, every joint was sealed, every support was reinforced. When they finished the structure, a painting crew came to apply the white coating. The transformation was remarkable. What could have been a prison-like barrier became something almost elegant, a clean white line against the landscape. I planted the vines myself, Virginia creeper and trumpet vine, species that would grow vigorously but not damage the concrete. At the base, I seeded California poppies, lupines, and wild roses. In a few years, the wall would be covered in green and gold, a living boundary that marked territory without ugliness. The LED lights went in last, controlled by a timer to activate at sunset. When I tested them that first evening, they cast a soft glow that made the wall look less like a barrier and more like a feature. With the wall complete, I turned my attention to the farm itself. The original plan had always been to build an organic operation, sustainable and profitable. I'd delayed construction during the conflict, but now nothing stood in my way. I hired an architect who specialized in agricultural buildings and began designing the main structure, a barn for equipment, a greenhouse for year-round growing, and eventually a small house to replace the cabin. The greenhouse went up first, a beautiful structure with automated climate control and irrigation systems. Inside, I started my first crops: heirloom tomatoes, specialty lettuce, herbs that local restaurants would pay premium prices for. The work was satisfying in a way office jobs had never been. I could see immediate results, taste the literal fruits of my labor, and know that I was building something real and lasting. The HOA remained quiet. Occasionally, I'd see residents in their yards, and some would wave. I'd wave back. The relationship would never be warm, but it had settled into a mutual, distant respect. They stayed on their side of the wall. I stayed on mine. The new board under Iris's leadership proved competent and reasonable. They sent me a courtesy notice when they planned community events that might generate noise. Not because they had to, but because it was neighborly. I appreciated the gesture. 6 months after the wall's completion, I received a letter from the state prison. She'd written to me, a short note that her lawyer had probably reviewed before allowing her to send. The words were carefully chosen, legally safe, avoiding any admission that could be used against her in future proceedings. But beneath the careful language, I could read genuine remorse. She acknowledged that her actions had been wrong, that she'd let her desire for control override her judgment and ethics. She didn't ask for forgiveness, just stated that she wanted me to know she understood what she'd done. I read the letter twice, then filed it with all the other documentation. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She was serving her time, learning her lesson, and that was enough. My focus was on building, not looking back. One evening, I stood on the completed greenhouse foundation, looking out over my property. The wall gleamed white in the fading light, vines beginning their climb up the concrete. The cameras still recorded everything, but I rarely checked them anymore. The sensors detected nothing but wildlife. My land was mine, secure and peaceful, exactly as it should have been from the beginning. I thought about the title I'd chosen for this whole ordeal, back when I'd first decided to document everything, marking the property line with a 10-foot wall. It had seemed defiant then, a declaration of territorial rights. Now it feels different. The wall wasn't about keeping people out. It was about establishing clarity, creating boundaries that couldn't be misunderstood or violated. Sometimes the best fences and the best walls exist not to separate but to define, to say clearly and permanently, "This is where I end and you begin," and both of us are better for knowing exactly where that line is. The sun set behind the wall, casting long shadows across my property. Tomorrow I'd start planting the main field, beginning the real work of turning this land into the farm I'd envisioned. Leave a comment, hit like, subscribe, and if you'd like to help the channel grow, that little thanks button down below means a lot.